Good morning, Steve.
Hello,
I,
Doc. Good to
I
see you
usually
on this
I
day.
usually start the morning with a little bit of a weather report,
You do.
and my reflection on the environment. So out on the farm here, we're going to be breaking 95 degrees already out early uh, to getting all the garden watered before the burning sun hits us. But it is a reminder of the intensity of seasons is really a blessing. You know, uh, I think that's my thought as I look at the weather and just nature is I love the fact that there are multiple seasons where I live. You don't have that. You're a more narrow season guy in Southern California. Um, I remember that from being in Florida, that when we had summer and mini summer. We didn't really have like winter and fall and spring, but here in the Midwest, we get all of those seasons, and there's something rich about that because I think life is like that. Um, I was reading the parent to parent newsletter this morning. Um, Ms. Rhonda does a beautiful job, and she was writing about how intense students families have with their sons specifically. She's writing about that. Uh, and the trouble starts in the home, but nobody knows it. You know, it's happening behind closed doors often, especially in the early stages. Um, and just how vulnerable and that makes a parent feel when they see things crumbling, but they're
Wow.
crumbling behind closed doors and they don't know who it's safe to invite into that world, and they just feel weak. Uh, and alongside that, I answered several emails today from parents that are just asking me, hey, what did I do wrong? Please tell us what I did. Tell us what we did wrong. And they're just so willing to take on the responsibility of their child not being, in a productive and a functional space. And so my heart goes out to them. It is intense, and adolescence brings intensity. And I try to encourage them with that.
Well,
Uh,
that's so good, Doc. And before we started our session, by the way, good morning to you or good day to you. And um, we talked about maybe we discuss because people are always asking me, Doc, how do people come to you? And what are the conditions that generally drive or motivate them to pick up a phone or tap on a direct message or send a text? There's so many methods of communication now. So I said to you at the beginning, maybe we spend some time and think about how do folks find us? And you use this word vulnerability. And vulnerability, and by the way, Miss Rhonda's piece, I read it too, and she quoted a verse of scripture where Jesus says that, not a sparrow falls from the sky
mhm.
that he's not aware of. And I, of course, love that because it's the pretext to the first novel that I ever wrote, Through Gates of Fire,
Mhm.
Volume
Yeah.
1, Wingless Flight, which is my definition of faith. And so I related to that. And whenever I see a verse of scripture that reminds me of things I've done, it brings us back to this idea, this causative action, Doc. Causative action. And the first thing I think that we should discuss, at least I'd like to discuss, is vulnerability. I'd like to talk about what it feels like in an age of what seems to be such certainty for so many. I have this friend that I play tennis with. I'm an aging tennis player. And he took me aside the other day after one of our sets. And he said, I seem to be the only person struggling right now. Oh, no, I'm struggling.
But
But let's,
people often see that they feel that they are in isolation. and they are other than the rest of their family or the rest of their friends or the rest of their church or their coworkers, that there's something unique about the battle that they're in. Um, that's true. I know that I have felt that at times. And I think maybe it's because of the intensity. It's so intense that your attention is taken away from what other people might be contributing, or what you might observe in somebody, and
Sure.
you're seeing yourself, and you're seeing whatever that current struggle is. Vulnerability pulls us inward.
So let's try to discuss a little bit, Doc, about, I love your word intensity. Let's remind, first off, all of us that intensity doesn't last forever. I think the first thing we need to, and I'm always pointing the fingers back at myself, right? It's like that
Mhm.
old thing, when you're doing this, there's three coming back at you.
Right.
Intensity doesn't last forever, Doc. And there are seasons when life is really intense. And for the people that we talk to, that you and I have the privilege, for me, it's an honor, Doc. I never see it as a burden. You and I don't know that I've ever discussed that, but I don't ever see it as a burden. Well, the first thing I want to remind all of us is that intensity is for a season. It doesn't last a lifetime. That's the first thing. Do you want to talk about that? Do you want to discuss
I,
that? Or
I
do you want to skip along?
No, the way I say that, even when it just comes to any single emotion in the counseling session, I'm like, every emotion has a beginning, middle, and end, and they don't stay. Emotions don't stay in a certain space. In order for you to experience a continual state of high emotions, there has to be this kind of cycling. All right, so there's a vortex that you have to create. That's why people call it racing thoughts or whatever, because there's this constant movement. And so even like in mindfulness techniques and relaxation techniques, when you ground yourself, just the
Right.
simple act of grounding slows that process and allows the emotion to go from the beginning, the middle, and the end. Now, that doesn't mean that emotion may not come back and have another wave of it. That's why we have that phrase, wave of emotions, um, that happen. And so I see it like that. And that's comforting to know that when I'm in the peak of emotion, it's not going to last forever. It's going to subside. I just have to wait for it to subside. Um, and it's not a constant state. Uh, yeah. I think that's important for people to realize, because it allows you to hold on, to persevere, um, and to glean what can be received in that moment. If I go back to the heat I was talking about earlier, it is the dry seasons, the intense seasons, that causes roots of trees to go deep. And I went to Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary back in the 80s, and they had just this beautiful campus on the seminary hill. And they watered the ground all the time, and they had these beautiful big trees. Uh, and I noticed in the couple of years that I was there that it only took one small storm to come by and blow a tree over, because they watered the ground so often. The trees never took deep root. And there's something to be gleaned even in the intense moment.
I like that a great deal. Intensity. Lesson one from what we're talking about is intensity doesn't stay at its current level of, rise or cresting. It will crescendo, and there'll
Mm-hmm.
be I love your word wave. There is an ebb and a flow to it. So I suppose the message for me today, Doc, uh, is to remind all of the people that are near me, and all the people that come into my sphere of influence, for whatever reason, that intensity is not always going to be overwhelming. And there are techniques and skills and devices that you can begin to implement into your life that really do allow you the capacity to grow those deep roots. And Doc, I love when you were talking a moment ago about the rains that come, or the storms that come rather, and how they quickly uprooted those trees. And for me, as you know, I've been meditating for many, many years, and meditation for me is simply this capacity to bring God into my day, into my space. And I've been pretty faithful with that for 30 plus years. And I notice when I don't do it now, Doc, it's the absence thing. And so the kind of the remedy, or a possible remedy for highly intense moments, is to remember that you can quiet yourself. You can go to a place where that you can calm your breathing, where that you can slow your mind. I love when you were talking about the racing of the mind, that you can start to disconnect some of those transmissions that are just colliding inside of your brain. I would just encourage all of us to take a moment and learn how to step back. And I suppose when I look at this culture, Doc, I notice it's so fast, it's so quick, it's so overwhelming to so many people. And we got here because I said people always want to know, how do people come to us? And I still want to get into that topic. I just think it's really interesting to see the population of people that enter into our sphere. But I think I wanted to just kind of tidy that up for myself about intensity, and just to remind myself why I do what I do on a regular basis.
Yeah, let's stay here for a minute more, because this people often try to flee intensity, and understandably, especially if it's full of suffering, full of fear. There are definitely negative elements that it can even be dangerous. I mean, I think we have to face the fact that some people are living in dangerous situations. And so they may need to look at even exit strategies, or, what kinds of boundaries need to be established. And so those are real decisions that have to be made. I think without the groundedness that we have kind of stumbled on in our conversation, without that groundedness, they don't make decisions. You need that groundedness, which brings me to, I think, if we were going to make points, point two being that you can't wait to the intense moment to learn how to ground yourself. You've got to practice that. I love the fact that, you've been doing meditation for a long time. People have quiet times, or devotional times, or times of prayer. These are rhythms that they're in their lives, so that when they get to the intense moments, the rhythms are automatic almost. They're part of your automatic pilot. And that allows you to persevere and glean the most. So you have to, if I was to pick point two, it'd be those stabilizers for the intensity have to be built in non-intense times. In times that are absent of the intensity, that's when you build those patterns, rhythms, cycles that carry you through and ground you. Still you, help you make decisions.
I never heard it said that way. You have to develop those in non-intense moments, you said, these behaviors, these practices. And, Doc, in the work that we get to do when I'm in session, and we've had discussion about session, and I don't want to dive back into it, although I love talking about sessions. One of my goals is always to get is a bad word, but to help a person to be able to come to the place where that they can have conversation, Doc, in those non-intense moments and in those sheltered, if you will, enclaves, those moments of real protected care, and hope that they bleed those experiences out into other places with their families and with their conversations with other people. I really believe what you said is so true, Doc, to be able to develop these kind of, almost lifesavers or life stabilizers, and to be able to do those in those non-intense moments, and to be able to, if you will, work on enhancing and perfecting. There's no such thing as perfecting, but improving upon them, so that when you're struggling, when you're confronted, when you're intense, when things are not going your way, you're able to then at least have some mooring. That's a good word, isn't it? Mooring.
That is yes, I like that.
That you can come to. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I love that word, that concept that it does anchor you. And when you have that, that's where the virtue of perseverance is rooted and given life. I think some people wait until intensity to develop perseverance, and they're like, well, right now I'm developing rest. Well, no, perseverance as a virtue is something that is the byproduct of a whole life of experiences in every season, in every part of the day, in every part of the year, every part of our relationships, in every part of our productivity. It's what we're doing, what we build. So perseverance is really not just grit. Because I think sometimes if you are seeing perseverance as grit, what accompanies that grit often is bitterness and anger. And so you're desperate for the energy that you want from perseverance. And so you borrow that energy from anger, or you stir it up through anger rather than faith or confidence or assuredness. So grit is, I can appreciate grit, but I think grit is is a lower form of perseverance. Perseverance is far more than that.
Doc, let's take it out of the ethereal and out of the, pretty rainbow world, and let's bring it right down into really what I think is an important topic for us to talk about, which is, how do people find us? How do people get into those intense, let's talk about the intense kind of things that are what we call in our world presenting problems. What are some of the things that become so unmanageable and so undealable with that they have to come to the place where that they send us a text, or they find us through the internet, or they listen to a podcast? Let's just talk about some of the universe that brings a person and puts them in a place where that they allow us, people like us, to begin to peek into their windows. Well, let's just talk about that. To me, that is one of the most fascinating things, because I said just yesterday, a friend of mine I hadn't seen in 3 years comes into town. What in the world causes a person to want to talk to you? And I gave him a list. I've got a list. I know you have a list, but I think it'd be interesting to know what kinds of welcome mats are on our front porch as people come forward.
Start with your list. What did you say to him?
Well, I said to him, obviously the biggest one, of course, were drugs and alcohol, right? Can't live in this culture. Cannot live in this culture and not be impacted by drugs and alcohol. No matter where I go, Doc, you and I get to speak in a lot of places and present in a lot of forums. And it's impossible for me to present, I'm tingling again, in any forum. I don't care what it is, Doc, without drugs and alcohol being present. Just not possible. And so that's where I always start. I don't know how about I've got
I mean,
half a
do you
dozen
mean
others.
present or present like the drugs and alcohol are right there, or that's a problem that is present?
Well, we don't know about the first one, do we? We don't even know if they're present, meaning people carry them into our world. I can't answer that. But by present, I mean they are present, active, and they are they are vital elements that are causing friction and ramping intensity levels in families' life.
Yeah. I think that's common. That's a common problem that pushes people out of the privacy.
Yes.
Um, so drugs and alcohol are that. Sexuality pushes people out of privacy. All kinds of dysfunction in that arena. Um, that self-worth would also, I think, be fair game to throw on that list. That they they feel so depreciated in their sense of self that they are compelled to seek help. Uh, you know, because I think for people in that situation, they almost feel like they're going to disappear,
Yeah.
and so they seek help. Sometimes that shows up in crisis like suicidal ideation. Sometimes that's isolation. Um, what a parent who says, my kid never comes out of their bedroom, or my kid will not go to school. So some extreme sense of isolation uh, brings that. There's always that point of crisis, that tipping point of this can't stop. I mean, this can't keep going.
Yeah.
Um, I think you've talked about it before. I'm trying to remember how you say it. You talk about I've had enough. I'm not going to. There's that moment where they are shifting, and they don't know what the solution is, but they're going to pursue something because the current state cannot continue. And
Glasser calls that the negative sort, Doc. That's his term, not my term. But you're right, where they come to the place where they say, no, no more. This is it, basta, enough, kind of a thing. I love what you're talking about when you kind of listed these things that you see with sexuality. And by the way, you are an expert on that. I am not. In terms of how you manage that, it's magical the help you bring to people, and I admire that, and I mean that. That's not flattery. That is just fact. I talk about this lack of or erosion of confidence, and when I see that, Doc, I see it more as the self is kind of, it just moves past fog and into opaque. That's kind of the way I describe that. And then, of course, you talk about these families that are presented with this avalanche of issues from students. There's a word that I use a lot, but a child that won't, and there's this list of won't stock. The student or the child won't go to school. They won't participate in the family. They won't come out of their bedroom. They won't be agreeable. And it's just this hardcore sense of won'ts, and they're so powerful. And when a family has to deal with that level of negation, let's use that word, and parents or guardians or whatever the word is you're going to give them, overseers, those responsible ones, when they're confronted with that level of disagreeableness, that certainly opens up people to finding welcome mats and just discussion forums. And it brings me back, Doc. One of the things you and I love to do is talk about case studies, because we do this work. You and I are practitioners. We're in the guts of this thing every day. And I think back to the families that have come to us, and the moms and the dads and the grandpas and the aunts and the uncles or the guardians or whomever they are, and they look us in the face and they say, I cannot get them to, and they list this litany. Right. And it's so harsh. And they come to the place where that they are not just feeble, are frail, Doc. They're at wit's end at that moment. And that's
Right
when that
there.
intensity level is pretty high, isn't it?
It is. And I think that when we look at that human experience of reaching that crisis point where some help is needed, it doesn't always come from the person who needs the help.
True.
Sometimes it's coming from someone that they are in relationship with, and that has the opportunity to look in. And whether it's been an employer that says, you got to talk to somebody. It's been a parent that says, I can't let my kid keep doing this. It's a spouse who says, this has to change. It's a friend that says, you need to see somebody. You need to get some help. In fact, in diagnosis of addictions, one of the questions that we ask often is anybody else telling you you need help? Is anybody else? And that, I think, is a powerful piece. What else are people saying in your life? We need to listen to them, because sometimes
let's back up our ladder.
What?
Let's go back up our ladder. When we do our work together, you say, Steve, go back up the ladder. I like when you do that. So let's do that.
Okay.
We started with this idea of the morning, the day, how it arrives. And then you brought up this topic of intensity. And we talked about how intensity is not always permanent, and that it comes in grades and waves, and that there are techniques that we can learn to deploy and personalize, Doc, that in fact do shrink them and make them manageable. And from there, then we talked into presenting issues. What brings people into our world? So talk some more about some of those that we see on a regular, ongoing basis.
I'm going to back up for a second, because there's one thing that you mentioned that is just flagging in my mind, is this idea of intensity. Intensity isn't just something that needs to be endured. That it is, in fact, intensity that causes us to grow and thrive. I've just started this book, and I hope we can talk about it in a future episode, The Anxious Generation. And one of the premises that the author is talking about is that protective parenting that emerged as early as in the 80s, crescendoed in the 90s, that this protective parenting where adults, in fact, manage all of the social relationships outside of the virtual world, that protective parenting removes some of the intensity that actually causes development, stability, perseverance, resilience, growth. And so that the byproduct of the removal of intensity actually is a weakened human being with more anxiety than a resilient human being. And so I'm struck about how important having intense moments is for us. Not just to survive, but to actually be human. In kind of the psychological world, we talk about learning. Learning comes when there's a mismatch error that the brain arrives at. Wait a minute, this is something new. And that something new says this doesn't fit. And then there's a sense of, why doesn't this fit? There's a sense of questioning. There's a sense of maybe even doubt. And as the brain starts to figure out what this is this safe? Is this big? Is this small? Where does it fit? Do I need to discard it? Do I need to keep it? So There's all these waves of questions when a mismatch error comes in, just in order for you to integrate a new fact. And so intensity or conflict, if I could even say, introduce that word into our conversation, is necessary for growth. The work I do, I'm thinking about a student that I worked with, and I watched them when they first came into treatment. They were reactive, incredibly reactive, screaming and hollering, all kinds of just having these, we would call them meltdowns, in common language, at every little thing. I mean, the slightest discomfort caused a meltdown. And he had a list of diagnoses, and I don't doubt those diagnoses. In fact, I would probably confirm them as a clinician. But his capacity to work through the world was always buffeted by accommodations, extreme accommodations, and his non-functional social relationships got worse and worse and worse and worse. So he ends up in this treatment center, and we're having to teach him that even when tough things come with the peer group that you're with, you don't get to respond that way. You have to find other ways to adapt. And I watched him, I guess 3 months, within 3 months, it was probably a 3-month mark. And I saw an encounter where he was actually out there playing football, not hiding in the background, but out there playing football, tackling, having a great time, laughing. And another student became aggressive, overly aggressive with him. And normally that would have been an outburst from him. All right. But instead, I saw him pause, pull himself back, protect himself. So he pulled himself back from the intensity of the other student. All right. That the out of balance physical aggression. And he told the student, calm down. He just told him that, and the student calmed down. The other student calmed down and kind of got his wits about him and says, I'm sorry, and apologized. And they shook hands, and the game went on. They went back to playing. So here, this harshness, he had to learn how to navigate harshness in an assertive way, but a non-reactive way. He acted upon, and he's far more stable as a result of that. Again, an intensity. And that was not something that was written up on a whiteboard for him. Now, I'm sure that there was scaffolding along his 3-month journey, but that was event after event after event with peers that were failures. It was failure after failure after failure, intensity after intensity, correction after correction before he finally got there. And if we would have guarded him too much from that, he would have only felt weaker.